Good morning to everybody. We are getting very close to the end of our study looking at the other lesser talked about evangelists of the New Testament, and more as we go through this study, I hesitate to call them the second string or the B team because as you kind of go through what they're doing very important work. It's just not mentioned very much in the record that we have in the scripture. So they're minor not in the way that they are lesser by any means, but they're just not talked about as much, and that's all. Basically the same difference between the major and minor prophets of the Old Testament. They both have very important work that they're doing. So I really have liked this study. Last week we talked about Tychicus and all the things that he was doing, going to places, going somewhere, being somewhere, always on the move. Talked about several times in several different places, pretty much credited with transporting at least 2 books of the Bible to their intended audience. That would be both Ephesians and Colossians, if I remember correctly. He also traveled with Onesimus, it seems, when Onesimus was going back to Philemon. So Tychicus has a lot of things going on. He was going to possibly be one of the men that was going to kind of take over the work that Titus was doing on Crete, possibly. We don't know how that ended up exactly, but he was one of the candidates that Paul kind of posed as a possibility in his letter to Titus. So Tychicus is doing a lot of work, even though he just seems to be a messenger on face value. He's also going to those churches to encourage them, and that is not a small work, especially in this day and age when persecution is rampant among the churches. And then we talked about Trophimus, who was introduced in the same verse as Tychicus, funnily enough. Trophimus is probably best known for being the reason Paul got the mob all stirred up in Jerusalem, even though it wasn't really his fault. From the context, it seemed that Trophimus was a Gentile, and some of the Jews from Asia saw him with Paul in the city of Jerusalem and assumed that Paul brought Trophimus into the temple, which doesn't seem to be the case, but that didn't matter to them. They weren't really interested in investigating that. They were interested in getting at Paul. So Trophimus sort of becomes a little bit of a scapegoat in that whole standoff, but not his fault by any means. But we do see him mentioned later in the book of 2 Timothy, which is very, in time-wise, is one of the last letters that Paul writes. And he had been doing some work with Paul, and the last thing, at least Paul knows about Trophimus, is he had to leave him behind in Miletus because Trophimus got sick, and he couldn't keep going with Paul. So the only reason he stopped at all was because he physically couldn't do it anymore. Now, whether he recovered and went on and did more work later, or possibly Timothy met up with him later, we're not given any details of that in Scripture because that's kind of the end of the record. So the writing doesn't keep going after that. We don't really know what to assume with that. Now, I don't think we got to Epaphroditus last week, did we? Okay, great. Because when I was looking back, I'm like, I'm not exactly sure where I stopped. I was like, I'll go back to the live stream from last week and I'll watch it and I'll know where I stopped. Well, the problem is the live stream ended early. Something happened in the system, and I know we talked about Trophimus, but I never get there in the live stream. So, I'm just making sure I'm starting in the right place. So let's talk about Epaphroditus. He is a man only mentioned a couple times in the letter to the Philippians. Now, we don't know many details about him, aside from the sort of harrowing mission that he undertook, which nearly cost him his life. Now, he's mentioned in 2 places in Philippians. He's mentioned in the 2nd chapter and in Philippians chapter 4. And I actually want to start with Philippians chapter 4. I'll kind of make sense, and we'll go back to Philippians 2 later. Someone go to Philippians chapter 4 and read for us verses 15 through 18, please. 15 through 18.
Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed to Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma,
Okay. The reason I wanted to start here, because I think this is a better introduction to Epaphroditus. I think chapter 2 just kind of talks about a bunch of his stuff without really giving him a good introduction, or not as good as chapter 4 of Philippians does. So we're starting with chapter 4. We'll work our way back. So we learn from this set of scriptures that Paul, at this moment when he's writing this letter, he's not really getting any support from the other churches in the region, except from the church of Philippi. Now, if you go through this letter, you will understand the nature of this church of Philippi. It was great. They were very generous, supporting him really beyond what they really should have been doing. They're sort of, in many ways, a contrast to the church of Corinth, where the church of Corinth, it's a very wealthy area. They had all these amenities, the things that they could have been doing. And Paul is kind of having to prod them along a little bit over the course of a couple letters. But the Philippians they're coming up with this on their own. They're like, we're going to support Paul. He's not begging for this, but we're going to go and we're going to help him. And he's really expressing his appreciation for that because they're kind of the only ones doing that for him. So they're really providing for his physical needs at this point. And he specifically mentions, in the support, being brought to him by a man named Epaphroditus. Now, we assume, I think this is a safe assumption, that Epaphroditus was one of the men from the church at Philippi, but he's not mentioned in Acts when Paul travels through there. If you think of, the story of Lydian, the Philippian jailer, and all those things that happened in Philippi, this guy is not mentioned here. We don't see his name come up. So there's a couple things that we could think about. Where does this guy come from? It may be that this man became a disciple maybe at the time when Paul was there and he's just not mentioned. It's fully possible. And I think this is probably a little bit more likely, is he became a Christian after Paul left Philippi. And if you think about it in this way, this man is undertaking this job to go help Paul, and he's never even met Paul, if that's the case. That's sort of the line I go to. I can't for sure 100% say that's the case. I think it's a better story, maybe, in my head. But when Paul left Philippi, we know that Silas and Timothy went with him as well. They do split up later for a bit, but at that point, those three are together. But do you remember who seemed to be left behind in Philippi to continue a little bit of the work there after Paul left? Does anyone remember? Talked about it at the very start of the study. Now, Timothy was with Paul, at least at that point. He kept going with him. What about Luke? Don't forget about Luke. It's easy to forget about Luke because he doesn't really talk about himself. He just uses Paul does this, they did that, and then you suddenly get, we went here and we went there, but that ends at Philippi. After Paul leaves Philippi, it goes back to Paul, they, them, they went and did this. You don't see Luke including himself in that group when Paul leaves Philippi. So I sort of came to this assumption when we were starting the study, and we began with Luke, that Luke was left behind in Philippi. And Luke may have been doing the work, and maybe Luke's work led to this man Epaphroditus becoming a Christian. That's the story I like to think about. Now, does the scripture say that? No, but the coincidences are, they're there. So I think it's a nice little story. But the scripture doesn't say that specifically. I think that's a good possibility. But we just don't know. We just don't know a lot about this guy in particular. But the way I kind of think about him is this is how it came to be. But that's really our main introduction to him. Let's go back to Philippians chapter 2 to learn really more about the work he was doing and how he helped out Paul at this moment. So I'm going to read for us, and this will be a little bit lengthier. Philippians chapter 2, someone read for us verses 19 through 30, so 19 through the end of the chapter.
you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. Welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and honor men like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help you could not give him.
Okay, thank you. So this really talks about more about what was this man Epaphroditus doing, which is why I wanted to come back to this later after we talked about him in chapter 4. So Paul begins this section of verses talking about his plan to send Timothy back to them. Remember, Timothy was with Paul and Silas and Luke when they first went to Philippi. We talked about this. We talked about Silas and we talked about Timothy. While Paul and Silas were thrown in prison while they were there, Timothy and Luke did not seem to be. So Timothy and Luke were kind of keeping things together in this really newly established church, and I guess growing, because it seems that more people kept being added after this. While Paul and Silas were for a short time detained. And so they know Timothy. He's not a stranger to them. From all we understand, he stayed at the house of Lydia during the time Paul and Silas was in prison. So this is not a stranger to them. He's going to send Timothy to him. They know him. Paul just kind of adds to his reputation, I guess. But he continues on. He says, I'm also going to send back to you Epaphroditus. Paul acknowledges Epaphroditus as a brother, a fellow worker. He calls him also a fellow soldier. I wonder if this is sort of an Archippus situation. Does he call him fellow soldier? Is he actually a soldier? Is that his profession? Not clear, but it is interesting. He adds that qualifier or that quality to him in speaking about this man. Paul then mentions that Epaphroditus had become ill at some point in his mission to aid Paul. Now, it's not clear to me whether this happened while he was en route to Paul or while he was with Paul, but this is not like a minor cold where he's like, I've just got the sniffles, give me a few days, I'll get over it, and it'll be fine. This guy almost dies. This is a major illness of some kind, whatever it is, that we see talked about in verses 27 and 30. It says he almost died from whatever this issue was, and it's interesting to see kind of the attitude of Epaphroditus. He's worried about the people in Philippi who had heard that he was ill, and he's anxious about them being anxious about him. So it's clear that Epaphroditus really cares about the people at Philippi, which is why Paul wants to send him back so that everyone can be kind of calmed down and comforted that everything's worked out all right. Everything's fine now. I think that's